Shall we begin?
Yeah.
So just for the very few people here today who haven't had the advantage of knowing Paul, I'll provide a very short introduction. And before I begin, I just want to introduce Anna here, Anna Dowling, who will be the manager of the Zoom meeting. So if you have any issue that you'd like Anna to notice, just pop something in the chat box or put a question there. Okay, so Paul Nation, as you know, is an emeritus professor of applied linguistics in the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies here at Victoria University. He's taught in many countries, in Indonesia, Thailand, the United States, Finland, and Japan. And his specialist interests are language teaching methodology and vocabulary learning. He has written over 250 books, articles, and book chapters. I counted up on the website, Paul.
I've never counted.
It's over 250. And his books have been translated into at least 5 other languages. And as we know, also many of his books and resources are available free on his website. And this includes also a range of speed reading texts. And what I think we all love about Paul's work is that it's always practical and accessible, with the language learner and the teacher always firmly in mind. And what you may not know about Paul is that he was a founding member of WATESOL in the mid-1980s. And Paul helped with the establishment of TESOLANS, the national body. I think that's correct, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah, I was the first president.
Yes, that's right. the first president of WATESOL or of TESOLANS?
TESOLANS.
Ah, right. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So welcome, Paul. We're all really interested to hear what you have to say today. And
Okay, I'll now try and share my screen, I guess.
Right. Yes, thank you.
Someone else is sharing.
Yes, they are.
Okay. Now let me. Stop. This is terrible. Should be there. Here it is. Oops. Okay. Go back to the beginning. Okay. Am I loud and clear now? So. Yep. Okay. Good. Today I want to talk about the principles of vocabulary learning and their application. I think that these principles apply to most kinds of learning as well, outside of language as well as within language. But
hey, Paul, yeah. Just make your slideshow happen so it's bigger, mate. You've got your slides down the side, which is fine.
Yeah.
Go down to go to slideshow, bingo.
And then from beginning.
Yeah, from beginning. Beautiful.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Okay. And so I think that this applies way beyond language, but we won't get into that today. Now, I think that vocabulary learning and most learning depends on learners giving attention to what needs to be learned. That seems pretty obvious. Now, I think there are 3 aspects to attention which are really essential. And the first one is the usefulness or clarity and accuracy of what is focused on. That is, in order to learn something, you've got to focus on it in some way. And if that focuses on something which is useful, which is clear and comprehensible, and which is accurate, then that's to the good. The second major factor is the quantity of attention. And this really involves repetition and time on task and quantity of attention like that. And the third factor involved is the quality of the attention that people give. So then there are 3 things involved: what you focus on, the focus; the quantity, so that means the number of times and the amount of time that you focus on it; and then quality, which is what operations are occurring, what thought processes are occurring while you're doing this focusing. And I've put these together into a diagram, and you can see the diagram's a triangle made up of 3 triangles. So the big triangle is attention, and then you have the 3 triangles of focus, quantity, and quality, and they are joined by 3 heavy black lines, which shows that they are all very closely related to each other. And sometimes it's really hard to separate parts, like parts of quantity of attention and quality of attention. And you might see that as we go on. Now, these 3 aspects of attention, I think we can boil down into 7 principles. I think that the difference between deliberate and incidental learning, so deliberate learning is when the teacher teaches or the learner studies, and incidental learning is the learning that occurs when we read, when we take part in spoken activities, when we listen, when we write, and when we use language. I think that there's no real difference in principles between these 2 kinds of learning. I think it's just simply a matter of the degree to which the principles of learning are involved, which makes a difference in outcomes between these 2. So I'm just saying that all learning depends on these 3 aspects. And it doesn't matter whether it's deliberate learning or incidental learning, which simplifies things considerably. So what I'm going to do now is to look at the 7 principles under the 3 headings of focus, quantity, and quality. I hope you were retrieving while I said that, folks, because that's why I was pausing. Not that I couldn't remember them. So we'll look at these, and then what I want to do is to show how these actually apply in learning activities. So when we look at the focus principles, and you might remember in the triangle diagram, these come at the top, then there is a principle, a very simple principle, and that is the principle of focus is simply we learn what we focus on. So learners should focus on the learning goal of the activity. Now, this seems so clear and obvious that you say, well, why even bother saying it? But there's a lot of activities where someone will say, well, we're trying to learn this, but actually what learners are doing is not focusing on what they're trying to learn at all. And so this is a very important principle. I should also say that these 7 principles are supported by probably hundreds of research studies. I haven't tried to list it here. This one, for example, relates to Joe Barcroft's work on what he calls TOPRA, transfer of processing resource allocation or something like that. But all of the principles, there is tons and tons of research to support these learning principles. Okay, so we learn what we focus on. So focus on the learning goal. Number 2, transfer appropriateness. So our learning is more useful if it closely resembles the use that we need to make of what we learn. So that if we're learning vocabulary, then we should be learning vocabulary, focusing on the aspects of vocabulary that relate to our use of that vocabulary. So if we're learning vocabulary for reading, then we should be focusing on the written form of that vocabulary. If we're learning vocabulary for speaking, then obviously we should be focusing on the spoken form of that vocabulary and so on. And this is partly where the 4 strands comes in that it allows us to get a balance of focuses on different aspects of vocabulary knowledge. The 3rd principle is the principle of accuracy. And that is, our learning is more useful if the information we are focusing on is complete, accurate, and comprehensible. Now, this once again seems such a simple, obvious principle. But for example, there's research on what's called the garden path hypothesis, or the garden path thing. And the garden path thing says you should lead learners up the garden path so that they struggle to get the correct answer. And then you give them the correct answer, which is more meaningful because they've been struggling to get that. Now, the recent research shows that that's not a good system at all. Frank Buss and Brian Strong did a really, I think, one of the most useful pieces of research in the last few years on vocabulary studies looking at learning collocation. and they looked at comparing the activity where learners were given 2 lists and they had to match the items in the lists. Now, they can make mistakes. They don't get any teaching before this. It's a trial and error sort of activity. And then they compared this activity with showing learners the correct collocation, and then getting them to do some retrieval or, bringing back knowledge of what they'd just focused on, which was accurate. And they found that the one where they got the correct and complete information and then did useful things to help remember it was better for learning than the trial and error one. So getting things right and accurate is good. And this comes to things like extensive reading. If you're going to learn vocabulary in extensive reading, people talk about should learners use dictionaries or not. Well, there's a whole pile of opinion about this, but all it is opinion. But I think you can answer that question by looking at principles. And one principle which does apply to that is, if you're not sure if the meaning you have inferred is correct, then check it, because accuracy is an important principle for learning. It would then argue for the moderate use of dictionaries during extensive reading. So they are the focus principles. Now we come to the quantity principles. The first principle here, principle 4, is repetition. The more repetitions, either verbatim repetition, which is doing exactly what you did before, or varied repetition, where you come back to the same material in a different way. The more repetitions, the stronger the learning. This is a very robust finding. There are hundreds of pieces of research on this, and it's obvious why it's true. The next quantity principle is time on task, and that is, the greater and longer the attention given, the stronger the learning. Now you can see that the quantity can come through meeting the same material again but it can also come from just spending time on one piece of learning. But these two principles are actually closely related. Now we'll look quickly at the quality principles, and these are the last two. So far, we've looked at focus principles, the principle of you learn what you focus on. If the kind of focus you are making is appropriate to the use you want to make of it, the better it is. And then the third focus principle, which I've now forgotten, is the principle of accuracy, getting it right, getting it complete, understanding it. And we've looked at the quantity principles of repetition and time on task. And now we come to the last two, the quality principles. And the first principle here, principle 6, is desirable difficulty. That when you focus on material, you should be doing it at the level which is appropriate to your level of knowledge, so that it isn't something that you just dismiss quickly, but it's something that you will have to give a bit of attention to in order to be able to deal with. And desirable difficulty is created by spacing, by retrieval, by testing rather than restudying. Interleaving means you do a task, then you do a different kind of unrelated task, and then you come back and do the other task again. And then that interleaving creates a better level of difficulty for repeating the task you've done before, because it isn't too easy. If it's too easy, you don't give it much attention and you whip across it. And this way you can see it's difficult to separate quantity from quality, because by doing spacing and retrieval, you're actually improving the quality of learning, but the quality of learning is increasing the quantity of time you spend on it. Because if it's too easy, then you won't be spending enough time, you'll just be giving it superficial attention. Okay, and then the seventh principle is the levels of processing, and that is deliberate attention, elaboration, and analysis increase and strengthen connections between the item to be learned and other knowledge that we have, making it easier to access the item. So that's giving it a richness there. Now, I think those 7 principles apply to all kinds of learning, and that you can explain a lot of learning just by looking at those principles. one of the reasons I've been looking at this recently is that I've been reading a very large amount of research in order to write the 3rd edition of Learning Vocabulary in Another Language. And I reckon that if I see a new piece of research that I haven't read before, and if I see the design of the study and the kind of measures that were used, I can tell you what the result of the experiment will be without reading the results. And I can tell you that because by applying these principles and seeing to what degree the study applied these principles, I can predict the learning outcome. And so one title I was considering for this talk, but considered not really appropriate, was, do we really need more research? Because if we can look at current research appearing and being able to predict the results without looking at the results thing, but simply looking at the design and the tests, then are we asking the brave questions? Do we really need to find out more about this? Now, that's tongue-in-cheek, because obviously we do need more research. But anyway, that's what lies behind it. Okay. Now, let's look at applying these principles. And the application of these principles is, I'm looking at from the point of view of vocabulary teaching. So at the moment, with these examples, I'm not talking about incidental learning, but I'm talking about deliberate learning. Okay, so focus on the core meaning of the word. If you are teaching a word, then you should focus on the core meaning of the word. And why should you focus on the core meaning of the word? Well, the core meaning of the word runs through all of the uses of the word. And so principle 1, focus on what needs to be learned. Well, you need to learn the meaning. And then principle 2, transfer appropriateness, that by focusing on the core meaning, you then provide access to all the other senses of the word when they occur. Give some examples of use, okay? So that when you present a word, you should show the word being used. And the reason for this, of course, is very similar, because if you want learners to be able to use a word, then principle number 1 says focus, or principle number 2 says transfer appropriateness. That is, if you want learners to use it, then you need to give them examples of use. So clearly, that's going to be important. Give pronunciation practice for the word. One of the ways I used to do this in class was simply to put up words that we'd been working on that come up in reading materials and various things, put them up on the board, and then we'd go around the class getting each learner to pick a word that they wanted to try pronouncing, and they'd get a little bit of feedback from me on the accuracy of their pronunciation. If they felt embarrassed and shy, they'd pick an easy word, and if they were genuinely wanted to struggle with a word, then they'd pick one that they were unsure about and had difficulty. So it was quite a nice little activity, because others could watch learners pronouncing words and then learn from that, but they could also have a go themselves. Examine the context in which the word occurred. So this is another way of giving deliberate attention, and this, of course, applies the principle of, first of all, the principle of levels of processing, because by looking at the context in which the word occurred, you are then making connections with other words related to that word and to the grammatical construction of the word and so on. So you're providing richness of knowledge to go with that word. And that would probably be the main justifying principle for that word. But then you would also come back to principle 2, and that's the principle of transfer appropriateness, because the context in which the word occurs is a potential context in which you can use the word. Provide some collocates. That's a very similar sort of thing to looking at the context, but this could be done, for example, by looking at by making a list of collocations of the word that learners study. So it's not necessarily looking at just one context, but looking at several contexts. Breaking the word into word parts, making sure that the learners know the meaning of the parts and they apply the word part strategy of relating the meaning of the parts to the meaning of the whole. This is, of course, once again, principle 7 in the sense of levels of processing, looking at analysis, and then connecting the new word to the known parts, and thereby helping learning. Now, you can see, of course, that when you break a word into parts, the principles of spending time on the word, time on task, comes into that too, because through the analysis, you're also spending useful time on the word. And then the focus, the learning goal for that could be the learning of word parts as well as the learning of the word. Transfer appropriateness principle doesn't really come into that piece of learning in a strong way, but it does in the sense that many of the low frequency words that we have to deal with, we deal with through analysis while we do our reading or while we do our listening, and we relate our knowledge to them. So to a small degree, that principle applies as well. Relate the word to spelling rules. Okay, once again, this is the principle of levels of analysis, where you can say, well, here's a word, and this word is really a very regularly spelt word because R equals R, and so on, and away you go. Or because there is one or two parts of the word which don't fit the spelling rules, and they might need a little bit of attention. And then at the end of the lesson, you might want to do recall, and that is to go back over what you've looked at before in the lesson. And then the justification for that, of course, is principle number 4, which is the principle of repetition, which involves retrieval as part of that, and that will help bring the learning on. It's interesting with retrieval because when we retrieve a word, there's a space between the meeting of the word initially and then when we have a chance to retrieve it. And so I chased up one of our ex-PhD students, Tatsuya Nakata, because it occurred to me that when we do retrieval, when we retrieve a word again, does the retrieval involve more time being spent on the word? So when we make a retrieval, are we also not only increasing the repetitions, but increasing the quantity of attention? And so the spacing becomes very important then. And if the spacing is right, then the retrieval involves reasonably strong, sustained attention to the word. And so there's a strong then connection between repetition, retrieval, and time on task, if you like, the quantity of attention and time being given to it. So it's quite difficult to separate those two. Okay, so these are the principles relating to the first presentation of a word. But of course, repetition is important and very important. And repetition is more important in the first meetings. And so the words need to be met again. My theory, well, no, my prejudice probably is that about a third of the time in a language course should be spent going over old material. Either going over it in exactly the same way it was done before, and at different times going over it in a different way from which it was done before. But we shouldn't always be moving on in a lesson. We should be going back to look at what was met before and making sure that that's really learned. And I would like to see course books involve this in the course book design. And in lesson 2, it would say, go back to lesson 1 and look at so-and-so, but do such and such about it. And then when you get to lesson 4, go back and look at lesson 2, but do such and such about it. Do it in this way. And I think that course books should design repetition and going back to the old material as part of the lessons. And I think at least a third of the time should be spent doing that. Okay, so at later meetings, you can get the learners to recall the form. Okay, and because if you want them to learn the word form, then really you should give attention to the form. And this is once again, principle 1, We learn what we focus on. And recalling the word, this is principle 2, transfer appropriateness. When we recall the form, that's something that we have to do when we speak and when we write. We have a meaning we want to express, and we have to recall the form to express that meaning. So recalling the form and recalling the meaning then fit those early principles of focus very well. Look at the role of the word in context. That's not just looking at it in context, but looking at how that word is carrying on the information in the text, or how that word is related to other ideas which are following or coming before that in the text, and so on. Do a pair task using the word. Alison Jenkins and I, many, many years ago, did an article where we designed a whole range of different kinds of tasks where learners could take a word from a text and then do this task which focused around the particular word. And if you go to my website and look probably in the late 1990s somewhere, you'll find an article about easy ways to design tasks to do that. Look at the word family of the word, and that is you come back to a word that you've met before and then see what are the other members of the family. And this is once again a way of looking at word parts, but also a way of increasing repetition, because if you see words as being members of the family, each time a family member occurs, it can become a repetition for the whole family. And so that's why giving attention to word parts, I think, is a very important part of a course. And it has tended to have fallen out of favor. But I think it really now needs to come back into favor, because a lot of research now shows that learners are not really good at seeing the relationship between members of word families and relating words to words they already know. So I think this needs to become now a more central part of a language learning course. Look at a concordance of the word, and that's another way. Okay, and then provide other words with the same stem, so learners then try and recall words that they've met before which have the same stem as words that there's a word they're focusing on. One of our PhD students looked to see how many words from the 3,000 to the 10,000 have a stem which has the same meaning as a word in the first 2,000 words of English. And she found that at least 2,000, or around 1/4 of those words in the 3rd to 10,000, had a strong relationship to words in the first 2,000 words of English. And so it's really easy then to relate these words back to words which are already known, and thus help their learning. And then learners can use word cards in peer testing as a way of getting recall of the words and so on. So that's the way in which the principles can be applied to the deliberate teaching of vocabulary. Now, the principles can be applied also in a sort of, how would you say, corrective way, or a way to improve what you do. And I'll give a few examples of that. When learners are learning to read, then it's a good idea, if you're sitting next to a learner and they're learning to read and they're struggling over a word, trying to figure out what that word is, then you shouldn't rush in with the answer. I think all teachers know that. And the mnemonic which has been used is pause, prompt, and praise. So that if a learner is struggling over a word, you don't rush in, you give them a chance to have a go at it. If they can't get it, then you give them a little prompt. You might give them the beginning of the word, and then when they get it right, you give them a bit of praise. But you can see that the pause, prompt, praise is actually applying some of the principles that I mentioned before. And that's the idea then of having a chance for retrieval to occur, so that there can be attention given to the word in that reading. I've already mentioned dictionary use and extensive reading. Yes, should dictionaries be used? Well, is your goal the learning of the meaning of words while you do extensive reading? If that's the case, then you want your understanding of the meaning of the words to be accurate. So it's probably a good idea to every so often check the words you feel a little bit unsure about. What sort of collocation exercises should we do? I've already mentioned that one. You can see how then by looking at the various options for doing collocation activities, you can then work out which is the better kind of exercise, which applies the principles of learning that I've mentioned before. Looking at dictation, it would be interesting to take dictation and to say, what's the learning goal of dictation? How does dictation apply some of these 7 principles of learning? Can we change dictation in a way which will result in a better application of these principles? Pre-teaching, should we pre-teach vocabulary or not? Well, it seems to me that you can answer that question as well by simply saying, okay, what's our learning goal? Are we focusing in our pre-teaching on what we want learners to learn? Does pre-teaching provide the opportunity for repetition to occur? Does pre-teaching provide the opportunity for analysis or levels of processing to occur? And so on like that. And so we can then make judgments about the activities. And the last example I've got here is using an experience approach. And that means, experience approaches where learners do a task where most of the knowledge required to do the task is already within their previous experience. And it's not too hard then to evaluate an experience approach by putting it up against these principles. Okay. So in this talk, I've looked at learning from teaching. So that is deliberate learning. But the same principles apply to learning through language use, such as learning vocabulary through extensive reading, through extensive listening, through conversation, through writing, and fluency development across the same skills. So I see no difference in the learning principles that apply to deliberate learning, deliberate teaching, and learning across the 4 skills of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. It's just simply the opportunity that those principles have to occur. And in general, incidental learning has such a range of focuses and learning goals that you don't get a strong an application of the principles as you do through deliberate learning. And that's why deliberate learning always wins out over incidental learning. But as you know, I'm also a very strong supporter of incidental learning because 3 of the 4 strands are all about incidental learning. I think the 4 strands gives you an opportunity to balance the application of the principles of learning. If you meet the same material across the 4 strands, then you have the opportunity for repetition and quantity of attention to occur. You have the opportunity for sustained attention, time on task to occur. You have the opportunity for levels of processing to occur. And as studies of reading text show, you also have the opportunity for the desirable difficulty principle to occur because words in a well-balanced course tend to recur in the reading and in the speaking and in the writing, and then you have a chance for the attention to be given at an appropriate level for that. So I think that fits in all right. Now, in order to see if you've learned what you should have learned from listening to the talk, here are some suggestions. We can't really do this on Zoom very well, but here are tasks which would help you perhaps to evaluate how well you've understood what I've been talking about. Now, I talked about a list of applications before, looking at things like, give the core meaning of the word, give some pronunciation practice, provide other words of the same stem, look at word families. You remember those applications. What you should be able to do, with a bit of a struggle, would be to go through each of those applications and say, which one of the 7 principles is the most important principle for this application? And then you should also be able to say, are there any others of the principles that also apply to this particular application? So you might remember when I said focus on the core meaning of the word, then I think that the major principle which is working there is transfer appropriateness. That is principle 2, transfer appropriateness. But I also think that focus on what needs to be learned, principle 1, and then principle 6, which is desirable difficulty, also apply in that activity of focusing on the core meaning. Desirable difficulty comes because when you have understood the core meaning of the word, then there is a level of difficulty involved in applying that to the particular use of a word in a particular context. And you've got to make that connection. And that seems to me to apply that level. So that seems to me then, it's possible then to look at an activity and evaluate that activity by seeing what principles it applies. The second activity of task that I've given here is looking at language in use rather than at deliberate teaching. And that is to say, how does extensive reading help vocabulary learning? So if we had to say which of the 7 principles apply to vocabulary learning from extensive reading, what would be the principle? What would be the number 1 principle? Because I think we can probably say that for each task, there's probably a principle that we could prioritize. For me, I think that the principle of repetition would probably apply to the extensive reading. Michael West saw extensive reading as a supplementary activity. I see it probably as a bit more central than that. But the idea is that extensive reading should be an opportunity to take largely what you already know and to meet what you already know in use and in a large variety of kinds of use. I also think that with extensive reading, the principle of transfer appropriateness is very important, because if you want to learn to read, if your goal is to develop a reading vocabulary, then learning vocabulary while you read is obviously transfer appropriate. And I would also think that principle number 6, which is a principle of desirable difficulty, works because generally there will be interleaving, if you like. You will meet a word in extensive reading and then you'll read some more of the text, and then you'll meet it again. And so there's been other things happening between the meetings, and that will mean that when you try to retrieve the meaning of that word, it will not be super easy, but will require some lengthened attention to the word. Okay, and then the last task that I suggested is the second part of the title, applying to vocabulary learning and anything else. Apply the principles to learning the road code. How could you apply the principles of focus, transfer appropriateness, accuracy, repetition, time on task, desirable difficulty and effort, and levels of processing to learning the road code. Learning the road code can be a deliberate activity. It can also be an incidental activity, but the government thinks that you should do deliberate learning before you do incidental learning in this case. So I probably fit into that camp as well. Okay. Some references. They aren't really references about the talk. These are just references that I want you to give attention to. Ave and I were talking about the measuring native speaker vocabulary size earlier on. That appeared a couple of years ago. And then Jannie van Hees and I did a book. And there's a chapter in that book for primary school teachers about word consciousness. And I think that learners should know these principles. Teachers should be able to express these principles in fairly simple ways. And I think that learners should be able to look at their own learning. And I don't know at what age you could start it, But I would think that even with very young kids, the idea of repetition and the idea of retrieval and the idea of spacing are very simple things that even young children could come to an understanding of. And these learning conditions are really embodied in principles which are so helpful that learners should really understand them as well as teachers. And so, as well as including repetition in course books, I would love to see principles being included in course books. And I've actually made up a whole pile of dummy inserts to go into course books, which gradually introduce learners to principles. But I'd love to see a language learning course, the ones that make a lot of money and publish, including the deliberate learning of learning principles, not only learning the language, but learning how to learn the language as it goes along. That's a lot, I think. I've done my dash. I wonder if it's worth, I don't know if you want to go back and look at the principles, but we can go there anyway. Maybe go here. Okay. Any questions or comments or criticisms or praise?
Paul, it's always good to hear you talk. Reminds us of all the good things that we need to remember as teachers. One of the things that always strikes me about the principled approach is sometimes we know what the principles are, but we tend to get caught up in what the curriculum's doing, or we have to follow the textbook, or we've got 900 students in the class, or there are kinds of constraints around that. What have you got any kind of suggestions on, or maybe the government says we have to do it this way? How do we, as language educators or as language teachers, or both, try and work with the principles and the constraints? You must have had quite a bit of experience of that.
Well, it reminds me of an American expression, which I'm afraid is a little bit crude, but it says, when you're up to your arse in alligators, it's easy to forget you came to drain the swamp. And I think teachers sometimes in that condition where you've got so much material to use and so much to get through, that you can lose sight of that you're there so that learning can occur. And it seems to me that learning is that's the job. The teacher should be seeing that learning occurs. And we have a very clear idea now of what is needed for learning to occur. I think that no matter what you do and what you have to teach, I think you can deal with it in a way which puts principles into practice. And that's why I looked very briefly at things like, dictation or whatever like that, because you can look at activities and you can say, well, if I make this small change to the activity, then I can actually apply the principle which will make learning occur from this activity, which on its own might not be terribly useful for learning it in one particular go. So if you have to deal with an activity that you think, well, they're not going to learn it from this and they really need to have another go, then you do come back to it again and you plan that repetition into your course. So I think it's not hard. I think you can teach with using many different methods or many different kinds of activities, but it's the way that the activities are actually applied and the principles that they put into practice which are really important. So I think it all comes back to just seeing how you can adapt what you have to do to make sure that learning occurs from that activity. Completion of the activity doesn't necessarily result in learning. And so you've got, as a teacher, you have to make sure that what happens during the activity results in learning.
Paul, do you find that teachers can sometimes get sidetracked by the activity? I've watched someone doing a communicative activity and then getting very flustered and saying to the students, but the purpose of this is to get as many of these into here as possible. And I said afterwards, no, the purpose was to learn vocabulary.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. It is the thing. I mean, it's hard to keep a class attentive and to get things running smoothly and so on. And this is where, up to your arse and alligators sort of thing. You've got to do all these things, but it really comes to nothing unless there's going to be learning occurring from it. And so that's why I think this isn't an optional extra. It seems to me that if you're not making sure that learning occurs by applying the best principles that we know, then somehow the job isn't being really done. But it puts a lot on the teacher. But the reason I've tried to keep the number of principles small is because I think that it's not too hard. I mean, if I can remember the 7 principles, anybody can remember the 7 principles, because my memory's all gone to shot. I have a feeling even that the principles could probably, even reduce to 3. That's why I put focus, quantity and quality, But then you have to have a bit of a deeper understanding of what focus, quantity and quality means. But I think it does get as simple as that. I think, are you focusing on what needs to be learned and what's useful? Are you giving it enough attention? And is there some is the kind of attention you're giving going to optimize or maximize the learning which can occur from it? So I think, the 3 things is once again an attempt to try and bring it down. But yeah, I think it's very important. Yeah. Okay. Let's see what's in chat. Go on.
Would you suggest then, Paul, that we try not to focus on a huge number of words and, just get through the list and then breathe a sigh of relief? Spend more time looking back and really knowing the ones that are core.
Well, I'm not a strong advocate of vocabulary teaching. And that's because I define teaching very narrowly. So when I talk about teaching, I mean the teacher standing up in front of the class or whatever and actually teaching words to the learners. And I think that that's not a very efficient process at all and has limited effectiveness, but you can increase its effectiveness by applying the principles. But I would give minimal amount of time in a course to actually deliberately teaching vocabulary. It's worthwhile doing, and in context of reading text when you need the word to move on and do things like that and so on. But I would say getting up there and every day deliberately teaching a certain number of words, it's highly inefficient. You need to spend 4 or 5 minutes on each word. There's several thousand words to be learned. You're not going to make it. And then if you look at research on the involvement load hypothesis, for example, when they look at a variety of activities which involve deliberate teaching and learning, you find that immediately after the experiment, people are lucky to get 50% correct on a test. And if you have a delayed post-test a week or 2 later, they're lucky to get 30% on the test. And that's for receptive knowledge. And if you have productive knowledge, the scores are even lower. So, I don't really advocate. I'd rather get learners learning vocabulary by using word cards and that. But once again, I'd want learners to understand what this learning is, why they're doing it, and how it's supported by other kinds of learning through extensive reading and extensive listening and all of that sort of thing. So, yeah. So part of the answer is don't spend too much time on vocab teaching. Seems a bit funny that I've made my career vocab and I don't advocate it much, but that's how it is.
Paul, there's a question here. Well, there are a couple of comments about the fact that this, I'm not sure if everybody else is looking at the chat, so I'll just summarize. So a couple of comments that this relates to clear and explicit learning outcomes, learning intentions.
Yeah, that's right.
And deliberate acts of teaching. And then there's a question, is it more about creating the right environment for learning?
Yes. The examples I gave for the main part of the talk were about deliberate teaching. But I think exactly the same principles apply to incidental learning as well. Mm-hmm. So there's no change of principles there. the reason why I dealt with them in deliberate teaching is because they're easier to see in deliberate teaching and that, but they do apply to incidental learning, and and teachers can manipulate incidental learning to do it. Yeah, the right environment for learning. I think the right environment is the right application of principles. So it's not, I sort of go along with Craik and Lockhart of the levels and processing guys who say rather controversially, motivation not important, willingness to learn not important. What's important is what happens in your mind at the moment that learning takes place. Now that's sort of largely dealing with principle 7 and ignoring the repetition principle. And we know repetition is extremely important for learning, but it's really emphasizing that there are concrete things in the environment that teachers should be applying and that learners know should be applied, and they should try to apply themselves. I think every learner should know that you should space repetition. Every learner should know that you should do retrieval. Don't, if you've got this and this, don't look at them, but look at them together first of all, but then cover up one. Or if you've read a part of the book, close the book and then say, now what did I read then? Can I think of any of the words that I meant while reading? But what was the content of what I read? These things, like those principles, learners should get lots of practice in applying these very simple but highly effective principles.
Paul, it seems to me that we spend a great deal of time teaching, a lot of people do, and very little time at showing learners how to learn. We just teach and assume that learners know how to learn, whereas in fact, they don't know how to learn, and consequently, a lot of the teaching is completely wasted.
Well, that's what I think too. And I did a booklet. You can find it on my website, something like "What Do You Need to Know to Learn a Foreign Language?" And it's now been translated into, it's a free book. It's available from my website. And it's now been translated into 4 or 5 languages, I think. Partly because if you could read the book in English, you probably don't need to know the principles. You've already learned it, but it's written within a controlled vocabulary too, to a large degree. And so, I think that's really important, that learners do know what the principles of learning are. One of my favorite stories of this is my physiotherapist. You probably heard this story, but I went along to physiotherapist because I had a crook shoulder. We got talking and I found out that he actually was a good friend of my nephew. And they'd worked in the post office together on the telecom, when telecom was at. And then he said when he did some telecom courses, one of the instructors in one of the courses said, here's how you can go about learning what I've just taught you. And he gave them some advice, and the advice wasn't that great, but it was okay. It was write things on Post-it notes, stick it in front of the wall on the toilet. So when you sit on the toilet, you can look at the Post-it note, and things like that. So the sort of principle he was applying was principle number 5 of time on task, and that's okay. But he said, when I did that, he said, I found I could learn quite easily. And when I was at secondary school, I thought I was dumb because I was getting low marks in all the classes. And so he said, and then when they made me redundant, he said, bugger it, I'm going to go and do a course in physiotherapy. So he went and did a degree in physiotherapy, And his teacher, teaching him how to learn, showing him how to learn, gave him confidence that he could actually tackle these things that he thought were way beyond him, And he's actually a very well-known physiotherapist now around Wellington, has been physio for some of the well-known sports teams and so on. And I think that that's the result of a teacher not only dealing with the material, but saying, here's how you can go about learning this material. Here's how you can improve your learning. So I think it's really important. Yeah.
So I think we've got time for one more question, if there is a question. And was there a question in the chat box?
Oh. No further questions. So you can either put one in or just unmute yourself to ask it.
Yeah, and there's a handout for this talk that Nikki's going to put up for people to to download. So the handout has everything which is on the on the PowerPoints. And so you don't need to remember the 7 principles yourself, but you'll be able to get it in the handout. So thank you for your attention. I'll probably continue with the idea of, do we need more research, looking at how you can predict the results of the research from the treatments and the tests. But nowadays I take my time writing things, so we're looking several years ahead probably. Okay, thanks for that.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Paul.
Awesome,
it's just
Paul.
amazing to be able to have this opportunity to hear you pass on all your years and years of experience, and you've boiled it down to some straightforward principles and applications of those.